Welcome back. So this week we are continuing the series on family from a place of design, deliverance, and destiny. And I would love for us to talk about navigating through feelings of obligation versus serving our family from a place of love. And also, what is it like to have to navigate the various wounds that you carry around because of family, also while still wanting to demonstrate Christ-like love towards them? So let's talk about it. Now, I really believe it's so important that we have these conversations and explore these questions because a lot of times people are unknowingly bound by feelings of resentment, suppressed anger, or bitterness because of choices that they've had to make or they're making for their family members. So I'm just going to ask you up front, what obligations do we have to our family? And I paused because it's not an easy question to answer. In fact, I guarantee that your answer is likely very different from the person sitting next to you or someone who lives on the other side of the world or even the country. You know, we all have different perspectives on this question, and that's okay. But I think what we should do is always be sure that we're clear as to how did we arrive at our answer, and is it rooted in a healthy belief and healthy expectations. So let's just start by defining obligation, right? So according to Webster, it means an act or course of action to which a person is morally or legally bound, a duty or commitment, a debt of gratitude for a service or favor. Now, this definition is loaded with what I would call intense language, but there are several words that really stand out to me. Morally, legally, bound, that's a big word right there. Duty or commitment, and lastly, debt. You know, and of course it says debt of gratitude. So we're going to talk about those. But if you were to think about the people in your life to whom you feel like you have an obligation to, which of these words resonate with you? So let's just kind of look at these together, right? Would you say that you have a moral duty to your family? Do all of us? Do we all have some kind of a moral obligation to our family? And when I use the word moral, right, generally we're talking about what's right or wrong and what is considered acceptable behavior, which is typically determined based on, you know, the culture that you're in. And I hope that many of us would agree that taking care of those who have invested in you and poured into your life is morally the right thing to do. Taking care of children, the elderly, and the disabled, those who are disabled in our families, it's the morally correct thing to do. So would you say then that your sense of obligation comes from a place of morality? Now, I'm not going to touch too much on, you know, the legal reasons people have obligations to family because that's typically limited to just ensuring that parents take responsibility for their children, that caretakers, you know, do the right thing and what's in the best interest of those that they're taking care of. But generally, if the law has to be involved for someone to fulfill an obligation, there's an even bigger issue. You know, most of the time when someone has legal rights over a relative, they're choosing that commitment not because of the law, but for moral and or other reasons that we're going to discuss. Now, so far, I've just discussed the moral obligation that we have for those who have invested and poured into our life. And you know, listen, we got to challenge each other here, right? So 2 questions that come to mind here are, what about the people who did not play a part in your life, but they're still family? Are we morally obligated to them? If you had to say yes or no, what would you say? In my opinion, I don't think so. I don't think obligation is something that applies to every relationship. You know, it's an added layer to certain relationships that meet certain requirements. However, I do think it's important to note that obligation doesn't determine our ability to love, you know, our ability to show compassion, to give, to support those relatives who were not there for you. You know, I believe that those are just personal values and virtues that we should apply to everyone. But obligation, based on the definition, speaks to duty and commitment, and I don't think that we are obligated to be committed to the people who are not committed to us, unless God tells us to be. Now, the second question that comes to mind is, what if a person was committed to you and their commitment changes? Do we still have an obligation to that person? I think this is where you have to be prayerful and use wisdom. I don't believe that you have to be obligated to those who have disconnected from you. You know, that can set you up for a one-sided relationship and just kind of keep you in a place of disappointment. And by no means am I suggesting that what we do for a person has to be returned back to us through that person, or unless people do for you, then you shouldn't make any commitments towards them. No. However, unless there is like a situation and you're in a relationship and there's like an agreed upon separation for a period of time, you really can't commit to someone that's not there, right? And a lot of times you'll see this in situations like with children. They'll still feel this sense of duty for their absent parent, keeping them emotionally stuck and unable to move forward. You know, some people have been abandoned by a spouse, a sibling, or even a child. And so just remember that loving a person and obligation are two different things. I will say though, whenever a relationship is broken, it's very important that we are open to those relationships being restored. And if they are, perhaps your commitment to that person will be reignited. Now, another part of that definition we read earlier says that it's a debt of gratitude. Now, this statement stands out to me as well because I think that we often feel indebted to our family. And so we support them generally, like we'll start from a place of just gratitude. But then over time, it begins to kind of feel like a debt. So let me ask you this. Are you in debt to your family? You know, do you owe them something? And if so, what is it that you owe? And when will you know that it's been paid in full? I struggle with this one, you know, not only because I hate debt, but generally we don't love our debtors. We are not happy to have to make those monthly payments, but we do because we have to. And if we don't, there's a consequence on the other side. When it comes to being in debt, the debtor is entitled to receive what they're due. So are family members entitled to receive something from us? I think this is a very slippery slope, but it's the mentality that many people have, and inevitably this approach to helping family from this mindset of indebtedness, it opens the door for a family member to be taken advantage of, for people to feel unappreciated, and it opens the door for resentment between the one in debt and the debtor. Because a lot of times what happens is that the one who feels entitled acts entitled. And so the one that's paying off the debt, they struggle with these feelings of like wanting to be there for that family member while at the same time resenting how they're being treated by that family member. You know, have you ever been in that situation whereby on one hand you have a person who feels like something is owed to them and they don't receive it, so then they have an attitude, and then on the other hand, you have the person who believes that they're indebted to that person, so they keep appeasing them, all the while resenting that person's attitude and the fact that they even feel entitled in the first place, even though they also believe that that person is entitled to something. Have y'all seen that before? Does that make sense? Basically what I'm saying is if you believe that you are indebted to someone, then technically they are entitled to that debt. So is this your underlying reason for feeling obligated to your family? I don't believe family owes family anything, right? Outside of like a loan situation or, you know, things that we do or some type of contracts, right? Like, I think the things that we do for each other should not be based on debt. I personally believe that our principles and values should govern our choices and the commitments that we make. You know, to me, that's just a healthier way to govern your life. I find that people who blindly commit to family just because they're family without knowing their values and principles, there's likely an unhealthy sense of obligation that you're carrying. You know, values and principles have boundaries. Values and principles never take away a person's choice to be there or not be there for another person. You know, and all too often, people are doing things from a place of guilt and not love and values and healthy principles. And guilt, what does it say? It says, listen, I have to do this or else they will think this about me. Whereas love says, I want to do this, but tomorrow I may not want to do it, and that's okay. I don't love them any less, but I know my limitations. Guilt says, if I don't do this, I'm not a good fill in the blank, daughter, mother, sister, whatever, right? Love says, I won't allow one situation to define my heart for the people in my life. How many adult parents still think their grown children are children? And so they talk to them as children. They expect them to do everything they say to do, just like a child would. Have you ever seen this before? So now the adult child is generally struggling with feelings of not wanting to dishonor their parent and having to deal with the feeling of guilt versus wanting to be respected and treated as an adult who has boundaries and choices. And I remember struggling with this at one point, and I'm just so grateful to have a mom who perceived this and let me know that she recognized that I am an adult and I have to make decisions based on what's best for me. And that will include setting boundaries and sometimes disagreeing on things and not always being able to do the things that she's requesting. And this really freed me. But I'll tell you this, it took her having to say it a few times for it to sink in because of my perception of our relationship, I felt like I needed to have permission to be an adult, to be in her presence. Now, you may not have a parent who will explicitly say that to you, but give yourself permission to not carry an unhealthy sense of obligation for your parents. So, as we're talking about things like honor, I think it's important to mention that honoring your parents does not require you to do everything they ask you to do or to minimize your opinions and your needs so that you are always putting them first. This is very toxic, and we know that emotionally immature adult parents will put their children in compromising situations, so it can become very dangerous to adhere to everything that they want you to do. So use wisdom when engaging with parents, communicate with love, and always have boundaries. On the flip side, let me say this. If honor is really important to you, keep in mind, honor does not enforce boundaries passive aggressively. Honor communicates from a place of understanding, patience, and love. So keep that in mind when it comes down to implementing your boundaries. But let's say for others, you're in a culture where you really can't communicate to your parents, right? Communicating is just not acceptable. Perhaps try communicating to someone who they will listen to and will know how to help you to work through some of those challenges. So let's move on to the next word, which is one that I use quite often, and it's being bound. Let's stop being bound by people and carrying this sense of fear and guilt and unhealthy obligations. If you're afraid of losing a person because you're not just constantly meeting that person's needs, something is off. It sounds like you may be in a manipulative relationship. If your desire to, please that family member just kind of always overrides even what God is leading you to do, you are bound to that person. And being bound, whenever we're bound in anything, we are in a prison. And guess what? Someone is guarding that prison gate. This is where spiritual warfare is working against you, and you're going to need to pray for deliverance so that you can shift your way of thinking and doing things. We have to know why we feel obligated to the people in our lives. Ideally, I think that instead of obligation, we act from a place of love, right? And love is such a loaded word. It's an action that involves many things like patience, kindness, goodness, mercy, commitment, duty, morality, right? Many of the same attributes that obligation has, but without the downside. And operating from this place, it allows your heart to remain pure and takes away room for the enemy to use resentment or suppressed anger to take up space in your life. This is a good time to transition to that other challenge that I mentioned that we face with family, which is serving from a place of love when you've been hurt and are still carrying hurt from those family members. Now, if you listen to last week's episode, I talked about how, family is like a garden, and a lot of times that garden was full of both positive and negative experiences, But we discussed how that garden that you were raised in, it didn't start with the people closest to you. It was cultivated as far back as your ancestors go, which means that patterns within families, they didn't just start 1 or 2 generations ago, but often they're a carryover or the product of something else that's been carried over for a period of time. Unfortunately, what that means is that when those negative things are passed down, people will get injured, they will be hurt mentally, physically, emotionally, so on and so forth. Now, a lot of times, many people are injured as children or adolescents. That may have been you. And even some people as a young adult by their family. And knowing how to navigate that hurt that stems from those situations, it's not easy. Because one of the lies that are often passed down in families is to not talk about what happens in the family, that you have to protect the family at all costs, you know? And there's this other belief that's passed down that to just keep going no matter what, move past it and let it go. So the very people that hurt you, you're expected to move on without any intervention or restoration other than being told the value of forgiveness. So now you're in your 30s, your 50s, your 60s, and you're still carrying hurt from something that someone in your family did to you 40 years ago. And to add icing on the cake, you now have an obligation to care for that person or to support them because maybe they're older or disabled or they're just struggling in some kind of way. So what do you do? In these situations, I admonish you, I recommend you reach out to a therapist or a counselor who can help you work through that hurt. The truth is that no matter how good of a person that you are, wounded people wound people. It's inevitable because it's a subconscious response. You need to have a safe place where you can be heard and openly process those wounds so that they can fully heal. When you're whole, everything in your life gets better. The people even around you get better. You know, I think about the woman with the issue of blood in Luke 8. You know, she received her healing upon touching the garment of Jesus, that's what she came for. But she received her wholeness after he stopped and took time to allow her to tell her story and then spoke over her life, telling her to fear not. So there are times where you have received your healing, but you still have not been made whole. Just like the woman with the issue of blood, your voice is tied to your deliverance. It's the number one thing that the enemy goes after. You know, your inability to talk about things or to express yourself, it's not because of your personality. It's a result of the enemy strategically using people around you and even manipulating you to silence your voice. So when you get the help that you need, you will then experience the physiological and emotional benefits of actually forgiving a person. Because what happens is that we can forgive, but yet we are still wounded. And so it doesn't feel like we've truly forgiven. Now, listen, that doesn't mean that you haven't actually forgiven, because you can forgive, but your body will still be programmed to carry the pain. But when you're being made whole, your mind, your body, and your soul, they're all healed together. So don't wait for the feeling, right, to forgive, because forgiveness is not a feeling, it's a choice. And let me emphasize this for a second, because the truth is that God has commanded you to forgive those who hurt you. So it's a choice, but it's not a choice. We have to let go of those debts that others owe us. Why? Because every debt that we owe and the ones that, they owe, Jesus already paid for it on the cross. So forgiveness has to be our first step, but it's not the last. You need to be made whole. I recommend talking to someone, because the person who hurt you may not still be around. And if they are, they may not have the capacity to even have that conversation with you in a healthy way. So let's do our best to operate from a place of purity and wholeness. It's not easy, but God calls us to love our enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who despitefully use you and persecute you. How much more? for those who unintentionally neglected you, those who took advantage of you, those who were overly critical of you. How much more? And why is God asking us to do this? Because He knows that it takes a pure heart to not respond the way that our emotions want us to, or to not do things the way that the world does by cutting people out of our lives and just getting back at those who hurt us. He knows what it takes for you to possess His heart, the type of heart that will lay down His life, consider Himself of no reputation, and not allow the hardness of people's hearts to derail what He was called to do. You let what that person did or didn't do change you because you didn't know any better. But now let Jesus change you because you now have a choice. We have to serve from a place of love. It doesn't mean you have to always agree or like what that person does. In these situations, when you're dealing with someone who has hurt you, I find it helpful to focus on something bigger than that person or that situation. Think about how God is using you to be a blessing in someone's life, someone that's been made in His image and likeness, who He took time to fearfully and wonderfully create. Focus on the gratitude that you feel knowing that you're even in a position to help someone, or knowing that the same God who would use you to be there for someone else can use other people to be there for you to help meet your needs. Remember that we are all vessels who are privileged to be useful for God's plans and His purposes. When I do things for people, they don't owe me, because what I'm giving them is what was given to me. If people choose to do something in return, it is appreciated, but we don't want people doing things just because they feel like they owe us. And by the way, it's normal to feel disappointed when people don't show their gratitude. But one way to limit that is just to adopt the mindset of Christ and do everything unto the Lord and not unto the recognition of people. Listen, if you've been carrying resentment towards your family for any of these reasons, it's time to repent and receive grace from God to move forward differently. If you are bound to your family, pray and ask God, what steps can you take to be free and to serve from a place of love? I want you to recognize that you're feeling obligated is not always because they put that obligation on you. You may have put it on yourself because of your own fears and your own assumptions. Let's get rid of unhealthy beliefs around obligations and owing people in our families. Alrighty, you know what time it is. This is the time where we get to discuss a phrase, pattern, or belief that has been a hindrance to many in the culture. And if we eradicate it, it would improve your life, your family, and the community.
It's chain breaking time.
All right, y'all, this is going to be a hard one, but the behavior pattern that we are addressing this week is expecting the government to fix our communities and our families. The belief that the government will and should be trusted to improve the lives of our families and communities is the greatest deception that too many have become a victim of. The government is not responsible for our parents, nor should they have the right to tell you what is best for your family. Who should be responsible? You. And when you need support, who else should we go to? The church. We need to allow the church to step back into its rightful place as the provider of our support, the resources, and the social services that the community needs. Let's not expect the government to be our moral compass and meet the needs of the people. We, the people, are not powerless, we're not incapable, and we're not entitled. Let's take back our communities one family at a time. Now, let me close with a final word of encouragement. As you work through all your thoughts and feelings around obligations that you feel towards your family, know that it's a process, to shift from old ways of thinking and behaving. So show yourself grace and invite God in to give you wisdom and direction and counsel as you begin your journey. I see you living from a place of wholeness and making an impact on the lives of those around you, just reaping the fruits of all the love that you have been sowing. Until next time, shalom.